The wind at 18,000 feet was a blade. It didn't just push. It scythed, carving away warmth and confidence, leaving only the raw, shivering bone of a person. Sergeant Anya Sharma felt it press against the thin material of her fatigues, a constant, invasive pressure. She stood on the edge of the packed snow parade ground at the Joint Special Operations Alpine Warfare Center, a place the instructors affectionately called the freezer around her. The other candidates for the elite Pathfinder unit stomped their feet and blew into their hands, their breath pluming in the thin, crystalline air. They were all men, all broad-shouldered, barrel-chested operators, their faces etched with the easy confidence of men who had always belonged. Anya was the anomaly. She was shorter, her frame lean and wiry rather than overtly muscular. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. There was a stillness about her that the others mistook for fear. "Look what the diversity initiative dragged in," a voice rumbled, low and thick with contempt. Sergeant Rex Bulldog Miller, a man whose neck was as wide as his ego, nudged the soldier next to him. "Gotta check those boxes, right, Finn?" Corporal Finn O'Connell, younger and still seeking Miller's approval, offered a weak, non-committal shrug. He glanced at Anya, then quickly away, as if her presence was an embarrassment he was forced to share. "She won't last the week," Miller continued, loud enough for Anya to hear clearly. "This place chews up real soldiers. The long walk will break her before the first ridgeline." Anya's expression didn't change. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant, jagged peaks that clawed at the pale blue sky. She had heard variations of Miller's sentiment at every posting, every training course, every selection she had ever attended. The words were just noise now, as meaningless as the wind. Her focus was on the details, the way the snowdrifts formed against the base of the barracks, indicating the prevailing wind direction. The subtle blue tint of the ice on the flagpole, a sign of extreme, deep-seated cold. The way the sound of the approaching officers' boots crunched differently on the wind-blown ice versus the packed snow. Colonel Davies strode to the center of the formation, his face a mask of granite weathered by decades of command. He was a legend in the community, a man who had led missions in every sandbox and frozen hellhole the world had to offer. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over the candidates, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Anya. It was a look that measured, judged, and dismissed in a single silent motion. "Welcome to the final phase," he began, his voice cutting through the wind with practiced authority. "Most of you know the reputation of this course. We are here to find the 1% of the 1%, those who can operate, navigate, and dominate in the most unforgiving environment on Earth. We are not here to hold hands. We are not here to accommodate new standards or lowered expectations." His gaze flickered to Anya again, a clear, unmistakable signal to the entire group. Here, the mountain decides. Your gear decides. Your will decides. If any one of those fails, you fail. If you fail, you are gone. Worse, you become a liability your teammates have to carry. Do not be that liability. He turned without another word and marched toward the indoor firing range. The message was delivered. The lines were drawn. Anya Sharma was already a liability in his eyes, a problem waiting to happen. She adjusted the collar of her jacket, her face impassive, and followed the others into the cold, concrete structure, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind her like the gate of a prison. The air inside the range was thick with the smell of burnt powder and cleaning solvent. It was a familiar, almost comforting scent to Anya. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, sterile glare on the row of shooting lanes. The other candidates were already grabbing rifles from the racks, their movements loud and proprietary. They handled the newer M110A1 systems with reverence, checking the scopes, testing the action, the metallic clicks echoing in the cavernous space. Miller racked the bolt on his rifle with a flourish, a self-satisfied smirk on his face as he settled into a prone position. Anya waited. She stood by the arms cage, watching as the quartermaster, a grizzled master sergeant named Croft with a sour disposition, handed out equipment. He seemed to take his cues from the prevailing social winds, and today those winds were blowing cold and hard against her. When it was her turn, Croft grunted and rummaged in the back of a dusty locker. He emerged not with an M110A1, but with an old M24 sniper weapon system. The rifle was a relic, its synthetic stock scarred and worn smooth in places from years of use. The parkerized finish on the barrel was faded to a dull gray. "It's all that's left," Croft said, his tone suggesting it was an inconvenience to even speak to her. He thrust the heavy rifle into her hands. "Zero it and get on the line." Anya took the weapon without a word. She cradled it in her arms, her fingers instinctively tracing its lines. It was heavier than the newer models, less modular, but built like an anvil. Her hands, small but strong, began a silent, methodical inspection. She checked the bolt, feeling the smooth but worn glide of the lugs in the receiver. She ran a thumb over the crown of the barrel, detecting a faint, almost imperceptible burr on the rifling. Then her eyes settled on the scope mounts. She squinted, tilting the rifle under the light. One of the base screws was a fraction of a millimeter prouder than the others, and there was a hairline crack in the rear ring, almost invisible to the naked eye. It was a critical flaw, a guarantee of an inconsistent zero. A complaint would be seen as an excuse, a sign of weakness before the test had even begun. She knew exactly how it would play out. The woman, given a perfectly good rifle, was already making excuses, so she said nothing. She slung the M24 over her shoulder and walked to her designated lane, a silent acceptance of the challenge. Colonel Davies was observing, his arms crossed, a clipboard tucked under one arm. He walked slowly down the line, pausing behind the other shooters, his shadow falling over them. They tensed, their breathing becoming more controlled, their trigger presses more deliberate. When he reached Anya's lane, he stopped. He watched as she loaded a single round into the chamber, her movements economical and precise. "Something wrong with that weapon, Sergeant?" he asked. The question was not born of concern, but of suspicion. It was a trap. Anya didn't look up. She settled the rifle stock into the pocket of her shoulder, her cheek finding the cold, familiar weld point on the stock. "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady and quiet. "Good," Davies said, his tone clipped. "The target is 1,000 meters. 5 rounds. Let's see what you've got." He stepped back, his posture radiating skepticism. Anya exhaled slowly, her world narrowing to the circle of the scope. She could see the slight tremor in the crosshairs, a product of the compromised mount. She accounted for it, holding her breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report a sharp crack in the enclosed space. Through the scope, she saw the puff of snow and dirt a foot to the left of the steel target. A low chuckle rippled down the line from Miller's position. "Told you," he muttered to Finn. Anya ignored it. She worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, and chambered another round. She adjusted her aim, compensating not just for wind and drop, but for the rifle's mechanical lie. Squeeze. The second shot was closer, 6 inches high and to the left. The third, 4 inches left. The fourth, 5. The fifth, 7. Her grouping was a scattered mess, a pattern of failure for all to see. It was the work of a novice, not a candidate for an elite unit. She hadn't missed the target entirely, but she might as well have. In this world, a pattern like that was a declaration of incompetence. Finn O'Connell looked down at his own tight, cloverleaf group, a flush of second-hand shame coloring his cheeks. Miller was openly grinning. Colonel Davies walked over and looked down at her spotting scope, his expression hardening. He made a sharp, decisive mark on his clipboard. He didn't need to say a word. His silence was louder than any reprimand. He looked at Anya, then at the old, flawed rifle in her hands, and his gaze was one of finality. As far as he was concerned, the mountain had already made its decision. Her evaluation was over before it had even truly begun. She had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. The long walk began before dawn the next day. The exercise parameters were simple on paper, brutal in practice. A 3-day, 60-mile trek through the high-altitude wilderness, culminating in a simulated reconnaissance and overwatch of a target area. The candidates were split into two-person teams. It was a test of navigation, endurance, stealth, and marksmanship under extreme physical and mental stress. Colonel Davies, in his final briefing under the harsh sodium lights of the base, announced the pairings. Miller, you're with Jacobs. Thompson, with Sanchez. He went down the list, his voice a flat monotone. Finally, he came to the last pair. O'Connell, you're with Sharma. A nervous energy flickered in Finn O'Connell's eyes. He glanced over at Miller, who gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and contempt. Miller clapped him on the shoulder, a little too hard. Just try to keep up with her, kid, he said, the sarcasm dripping from his words. Don't let her slow you down too much. Finn forced a tight smile and nodded, his gaze darting toward Anya. She was already checking her gear, her focus absolute. She was packing methodically, her movements betraying no reaction to the pairing. To Finn, her pack looked lighter than her equipment older. While he had the latest GPS unit, a satellite phone, and a high-tech butane stove, she had a Landsat compass, a laminated paper map, and a simple Espit stove with solid fuel tablets. It looked like she was preparing for a different, older kind of war. They set out as the first hints of gray light touched the eastern peaks. The cold was a physical presence, a thing that seeped into the marrow of your bones. Anya set a steady, relentless pace. It wasn't fast, but it never varied. Uphill, downhill, through deep snowdrifts, the rhythm was constant. Finn, eager to prove he wasn't being held back, initially pushed ahead, but soon found himself falling into her metronomic stride, his own energy levels rising and falling while hers remained a flat, unwavering line. For hours, they moved in silence, the only sounds their own breathing and the crunch of their boots on the snow. Anya moved with an incredible efficiency, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain, noting landmarks, checking the angle of the sun, her internal clock and compass seemingly more reliable than any electronic device. By midday on the second day, the sky, which had been a brilliant, merciless blue, began to fill with a milky haze. The wind picked up, carrying with it the first stinging flakes of snow. The forecast had called for clear skies, but the mountain had its own agenda. Within an hour, the flakes had become a blinding curtain of white. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled, a malevolent, shrieking entity that stole visibility and sound. The world shrank to a 10-foot radius of swirling chaos. Command, this is Pathfinder 2 Bravo. Radio check. Over. Finn yelled into his handset. Static was the only reply. He tried the sat phone. No signal. A knot of cold, hard fear began to form in his stomach. His high-tech GPS unit, its screen already fogging with condensation, flickered and died, the battery succumbing to the abyssal cold. They were blind, deaf, and utterly alone. The simulated mission was over. This was real. We need to find shelter. Finn shouted over the gale, his voice thin and desperate. He was starting to shiver uncontrollably, the first sign of encroaching hypothermia. Anya didn't shout back. She simply stopped, raised a hand, and pointed to a dark shape looming in the whiteout. A massive outcropping of granite, its lee side offering a sliver of protection from the wind's fury. She had been heading for it all along. She had seen it on the map hours ago, anticipated the storm's path, and adjusted their course. While Finn had been staring at his failing electronics, she had been reading the world. As they scrambled toward the rocks, Finn's foot slipped on an ice-covered stone hidden beneath the fresh powder. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and crumpled to the ground. He tried to stand, but a bolt of white-hot agony shot up from his ankle. It was already swelling, the joint dislocated or broken. He looked up at Anya, his face pale with pain and terror. I can't walk, he stammered, the words barely audible over the storm. The crisis was absolute. They were miles from any known extraction point, in a blizzard that was rapidly becoming a life-threatening event. Finn was incapacitated, succumbing to the cold, and their only long-range weapon was the heavy, broken M24 rifle on Anya's back. a useless burden in a close-quarters survival situation. Or so he thought. He was the liability Colonel Davies had warned about, and he was shackled to the one person everyone, including himself, had written off. Anya's calm was unnerving. As Finn's world dissolved into a maelstrom of pain, fear, and swirling snow, hers seemed to crystallize, becoming sharper and more focused. She didn't waste a moment on panic or hesitation. Her movements became a study in brutal efficiency. First, she unslung the heavy M24 and her pack, placing them carefully under the granite overhang. Then she was at Finn's side, her expression unreadable. "Let me see," she said, her voice low and even, cutting through the howl of the wind. Her fingers, though gloved, were surprisingly gentle as she probed the area around his boot. Finn winced, gritting his teeth. "It's bad," he gasped. "I think it's broken." "Maybe," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "But we'll deal with it." She pulled a trauma shear from a pouch on her belt and, with two quick, powerful snips, cut away the fabric of his pant leg and the top of his boot to relieve the pressure. The ankle was already a swollen, purplish mass. Without a word, she began to construct a splint. She used the 2 aluminum stays from her own pack frame and secured them with practiced wraps of a SAM splint and duct tape from her medical kit. It was a professional, field-expedient job, done with a speed and precision that spoke of countless hours of training, or worse, real-world application. Next, shelter. The rock outcropping provided a windbreak, but it wasn't enough. Anya pulled a lightweight sil nylon poncho and an emergency space blanket from her pack. Using her trekking poles and some paracord, she rigged a lean-to against the rock face, creating a small, protected space just large enough for the two of them. The design was clever, angling the fabric to shed the wind and funnel blowing snow away from the entrance. Within 10 minutes, they were out of the direct path of the storm's fury, the roar of the wind muted to a constant, high-pitched moan. Finn, his teeth chattering violently, watched her as if she were a creature from another planet. His own state-of-the-art gear had failed him, but her seemingly archaic kit was proving its worth. He fumbled in his pocket for his windproof lighter to start his stove. He clicked it once, twice. A weak spark, then nothing. The butane was frozen. He slumped back in defeat. Anya didn't even seem to notice his failure. She pulled out her Espit stove and a single fuel tablet. From a waterproof case, she produced a small ferrocerium rod and a steel striker. She shaved a small pile of magnesium from the rod onto the tablet, then struck a shower of brilliant white sparks into the pile. It ignited with a soft hoof, the fuel tablet catching immediately, burning with a steady, smokeless blue flame. Soon, she had a small pot of snow melting over the tiny stove. She passed a cup of hot water to Finn. It was the most incredible thing he had ever tasted. The warmth spread through his chest, a fragile beachhead against the encroaching cold. "How did you?" he began, but his voice trailed off. He didn't even know what to ask. "How did you know the storm was coming? How did you know how to build this shelter? How did you know how to make fire in a frozen hill?" Anya just looked at him. "You watch. You learn. You remember," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. They spent the next few hours in silence. Anya periodically melted more snow, ensuring they stayed hydrated. She checked Finn's splint and monitored him for other signs of hypothermia. She was a machine of survival, her focus absolute. As dusk began to settle, turning the whiteout from gray to a deep, featureless indigo, a new sound intruded on the storm's monologue. It was the crunch of boots in the snow close by. Voices, muffled by the wind. Finn's head snapped up, his eyes wide with alarm. "Who's that? Rescue?" Anya put a finger to her lips, her body instantly tense and alert. She crept to the edge of the lean-to and peered out into the swirling darkness. 3 figures, dark and hulking, were moving slowly through the snow, their rifles held at a low ready. They were the aggressor force from the exercise, a team of seasoned instructors tasked with hunting the candidates. But their posture was wrong. They weren't hunting. They were lost. They moved with the weary desperation of men who were also fighting for their lives. Then one of them spotted the faint glow of their shelter. He raised a hand, and the other two converged on his position. They were less than 50 yards away. This was no longer a game. They were cold, hungry, and disoriented. Anya and the injured Finn were a potential source of food, warmth, and shelter. They were targets. Finn's heart hammered against his ribs. "They're going to find us," he whispered, his voice trembling. Anya moved back under the shelter, her face a grim, determined mask. She picked up the M24, the broken rifle. In the dim light from the tiny stove, Finn watched in stunned silence as she pulled a small, worn leather tool roll from her pack. With a surgeon's precision, her fingers moving with deft, practiced motions despite the biting cold, she began to work. She removed the bolt, wiped it down, and applied a tiny drop of specialized cold-weather lubricant. Then she turned her attention to the faulty scope mount. She took a small square of foil from a discarded ration wrapper and, using the tip of a knife, folded it into a tiny, precise rectangle. With the focus of a watchmaker, she loosened the scope ring screw just enough to insert the foil shim into the hairline crack. She tightened it back down, her sense of touch telling her exactly how much pressure to apply. It was an impossible fix, a piece of battlefield artistry that no manual could ever teach. It wouldn't fix the zero, but it would stabilize it. It would make the rifles lie consistent, predictable. She chambered a single round, the click of the bolt seating home unnaturally loud in the small space. "Stay down and stay quiet," she whispered to Finn. "Don't move no matter what." She crawled out of the shelter, disappearing into the whiteout like a ghost. Finn was left alone, his fear a cold, metallic taste in his mouth, listening to the approaching footsteps and the howling of the wind. He clutched the empty cup, his knuckles white, and waited. Outside, Anya was invisible. She didn't lie prone in a classic sniper's nest. She used the swirling snow as both concealment and cover, moving to a position 20 yards from the shelter, flanking the aggressor's most likely path of approach. She became part of the storm. The cold gnawed at her, but she compartmentalized the pain. Her breathing slowed, each exhalation a controlled plume of vapor that was instantly torn away by the wind. The three men approached the rock outcropping cautiously. Their leader, a big man with a thick beard frosted with ice, held up a hand, signaling a halt. He scanned the lean-to, his weapon raised. They saw the single figure huddled inside, Finn. An easy target, an injured man. The leader gestured for one of his men to circle around the side. He took a step forward, his own rifle coming up to his shoulder, aimed at the shelter's entrance. Anya had her shot. The wind was a living thing, pushing and pulling, gusting unpredictably. It was a shot that 99% of trained snipers would never even attempt. The range was short, perhaps 70 meters, but the conditions were impossible. She had to calculate the windage, the temperature's effect on the powder burn, the upward angle to the target, and, most critically, the known, now stabilized offset of her scope. It was a complex, multivariable equation she had to solve in an instant. Her mind went quiet. The howling of the wind faded to a hum. There was only the target, the crosshairs, and the space between. She didn't aim for the man's center mass. She didn't aim for his head. Her point of aim was a small, obscure spot on the wooden stock of his rifle. She exhaled half a breath, found the bottom of her natural respiratory pause, and the world stopped. She squeezed the trigger. The crack of the M24 was swallowed almost immediately by the storm. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the aggressor leader's rifle exploded in his hands. The wooden stock shattered, sending a cloud of splinters into the air. The weapon was mangled, its action twisted into a useless piece of metal. The leader cried out, more in shock than pain, stumbling backward and clutching his hand, which was bleeding from several shallow cuts. The other two men froze, their heads whipping around, trying to locate the source of the shot. They couldn't. The muzzle flash had been invisible in the blizzard, the report directionless. It was as if the mountain itself had fired at them. In a panic, One of them opened fire, spraying a full magazine of automatic fire blindly into the snow, the muzzle flashes lighting up the swirling chaos for a brief, terrifying moment. But Anya was already gone. She hadn't even stayed to watch her shot land. The moment she fired, she was moving, a silent shadow using their confusion as cover. She circled wide, grabbing a fist-sized rock as she went. From a new position, far to their left, she hurled the rock high into the air. It landed with a loud clatter against the rock face 50 yards away in the opposite direction. The two remaining aggressors spun toward the new sound, their nerves shot. They fired another burst at the unseen noise. They were shooting at ghosts. The realization dawned on them slowly, chillingly. They weren't dealing with a lost candidate. They were dealing with a hunter, an apex predator who was using the storm as a weapon. They were out of their depth. The leader, clutching his ruined hand, yelled something unintelligible. It was an order to retreat. They looked at the shelter one last time, at the promise of warmth and safety, then looked back into the terrifying, ghost-filled darkness from which the impossible shot had come. Fear won. They turned and plunged back into the blizzard, their retreat hurried and panicked. Anya watched them go, her rifle held steady, until their forms were completely swallowed by the snow. She didn't fire again. The message had been sent and received. She waited another 5 minutes, motionless, ensuring they were truly gone, before she slipped back to the shelter. Finn saw her appear at the entrance, a phantom materializing out of the storm. Her face was caked in snow, but her eyes were clear and calm. She said nothing as she disassembled the M24, wiping each part down before stowing it in its case. The impossible feat of marksmanship, the act of war she had just committed to save them, was treated with the same detached professionalism as setting up a tent. Finn just stared, his mouth agape. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a profound, bone-deep awe. He had just witnessed something that defied belief, an act of precision and lethality that belonged in a legend, not a training exercise. The woman they had mocked, the quota they had dismissed, had just faced down 3 armed instructors in a blizzard with a broken rifle and hadn't even broken a sweat. He looked at her, then at the rifle, then back at her, and finally understood. He wasn't in the presence of a soldier. He was in the presence of a ghost. The blizzard broke with the dawn. The wind died down, leaving behind a world of profound silence, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The sky above was a deep, aching violet. Anya, who had kept watch through the night, judged the conditions stable enough and finally activated her personal locator beacon. Less than 2 hours later, the rhythmic whump 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 of a Black Hawk helicopter echoed through the mountain valley. It appeared over a high ridge, a dark, predatory shape against the brilliant snow. The helo settled into a hover 50 feet above them, its rotor wash kicking up a hurricane of powder. A crew chief and a pararescueman rappelled down. As they secured Finn into a rescue stretcher, the senior pilot, a chief warrant officer with a weathered face and kind eyes, leaned out of the cockpit door, his gaze scanning the scene below. His eyes fell on Anya as she helped guide the stretcher. His professional calm evaporated, replaced by a look of stunned, absolute disbelief. The noise of the rotors was deafening, but his voice, amplified through the helicopter's internal comms and broadcast faintly through the crew chief's headset, was clear. "Ghost?" the pilot yelled, his voice crackling with static and astonishment. "Holy hell, is that you? I thought you were out." Anya looked up, her face shielded from the rotor wash. She offered no explanation, no grand reunion. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was enough. Colonel Davies was on board the helicopter. He had come personally, a sign of the severity of the situation. He had spent the night in the command center, listening to the static-filled silence from 2 lost teams, his face a mask of controlled anxiety. He watched the exchange between his pilot and Sergeant Sharma, his brow furrowed in confusion. The name meant nothing to him, but the reverence in his pilot's voice was unmistakable. As they lifted off, Finn safely strapped in and Anya seated opposite him, Davies leaned over to the pilot. "What did you call her, mister?" The pilot, his eyes still wide with awe, looked back at Anya, who was staring out the window at the receding landscape. "That's Ghost, sir. We flew her. Out of places that don't officially exist on any map. Afghanistan, mostly. Hindu Kush." He shook his head, a small, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. "They'd drop her in alone, sometimes for weeks at a time. Her and that old M24. The stories, we thought they were just legends. Impossible shots in sandstorms, targets a mile out. They said she never missed. Never. We called her the ghost of the Hindu Kush." Colonel Davies's expression shifted. The pieces began to click into place with the force of a physical blow. The quiet demeanor, the anachronistic gear, the refusal to complain about the faulty rifle. The M24. It wasn't just any old rifle. It was her rifle. The quartermaster, in his petty act of condescension, had unknowingly handed a master craftsman her signature tool. The scattered shots on the range hadn't been a sign of incompetence. They had been a diagnostic test. She hadn't been missing the target. She had been learning the precise nature of the rifle's flaw, calibrating herself to its imperfections. The report from the aggressor team had already come in over the newly re-established comms network. They had been found, hypothermic and disoriented, by Miller's team. Their story was borderline hysterical. They spoke of a single, invisible shot in the heart of the blizzard that had surgically disabled their leader's weapon from an impossible angle. They spoke of being hunted by something that wasn't human. Davies looked at Anya Sharma, the woman he had dismissed as a new standard, a liability. He saw her now not as a sergeant, but as the living embodiment of a whispered-about legend. The quiet, unassuming woman in front of him was a phantom, a master of a deadly art he could barely comprehend. The entire evaluation, the condescension, the broken rifle. It had all been an absurd, unintentional insult to a warrior of a caliber he had rarely encountered. His face, carved from granite, remained impassive, but behind his eyes, a profound and humbling reassessment was taking place. The mountain hadn't decided. The ghost had. The atmosphere back at the base was thick with a strange, new silence. The news had traveled faster than a radio wave, transmitted through the hushed, awestruck tones of the aggressor team and the helicopter crew. The story of the single, disabling shot, of surviving the blizzard, of the impossible field repair on a faulty scope, had dismantled the established social order. The swagger was gone. The casual arrogance had been replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. Sergeant Miller and his team, who had been lauded for finding the lost instructors, were now subdued. They had survived the storm. Anya Sharma had dominated it. The distinction was palpable. In the mess hall that evening, the usual boisterous laughter was absent. Men ate quietly, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the table in the corner where Anya sat alone. She was cleaning the M24. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a ritual of quiet focus. She had a cup of coffee, untouched, beside her. The rifle was completely disassembled, each component laid out on a clean cloth in perfect order. Rex Miller stood from his table. He walked over to the coffee machine, poured a fresh, steaming mug, and walked toward her. He didn't say a word. The entire mess hall seemed to hold its breath. He placed the hot mug on the table next to her cold one. Their eyes met for a brief second. In his, there was no longer any mockery, only a raw, humbled acknowledgement of a superior skill. He gave a short, stiff nod, a soldier's apology, a concession of respect more powerful than any words, then turned and walked back to his table. Later, a runner found her. "Colonel Davies wants to see you, Sergeant." Anya finished reassembling the rifle, worked the bolt once to feel its now perfectly smooth action, and followed the runner to the command building. Davies's office was Spartan, decorated only with maps and a single framed unit citation. The old M24 rifle lay on the polished surface of his desk, a silent testament between them. He gestured for her to stand at ease. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression a complex mixture of evaluation and newfound understanding. The final report from the aggressor team's debrief came in, Davies said, his voice flat, stripped of its earlier condescension. They confirmed the range at 73 meters. They confirmed the blizzard conditions. And ballistics confirmed the projectile struck the rifle stock, not the operator. He paused, letting the weight of the impossible facts hang in the air. That was not a shot. That was a statement. Anya remained silent, her posture relaxed but alert. Davies slid a thin folder across the desk. It was an official assignment order. At the top was the insignia of the Pathfinder unit she had been evaluating for. Her name was printed below it, Sergeant Anya Sharma. The quartermaster has been administratively reassigned to a supply depot in Greenland. Effective immediately, Davies stated, his voice cold as ice. From now on, your gear will be your choice. Any weapon, any optic, any piece of equipment in the entire U.S. inventory. It's yours. He looked her straight in the eye. Welcome to the unit, Sergeant. It was the closest he would ever come to an apology. It was the highest form of praise he knew how to give. He then glanced down at the old scarred rifle on his desk. A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps even humor, touched the corner of his mouth. Or, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, perhaps you'd prefer to keep this one. Anya looked at the M24, its worn stock and faded barrel. She ran a hand over the receiver, a gesture of familiarity, of kinship. It's familiar, sir, was all she said. That night, the sky over the freezer was a spectacle of impossible clarity. The storm had scrubbed the air clean, and the stars burned with a cold, fierce light, scattered like diamonds on black velvet. The wind was gone, and a profound, ringing silence had settled over the snow-covered peaks. Anya Sharma was on the deserted firing range, not for training but for a private communion. She was alone, a solitary figure under the vast, star-dusted canopy. She lay prone in the snow, the old M24 settled comfortably in her shoulder. The bipod was deployed, anchoring the rifle to the frozen earth. She wasn't aiming at a target. She didn't chamber around. She simply looked through the scope, the powerful optic drawing a distant, moon-washed peak into sharp focus. She could see the texture of the snow, the deep blue shadows in the crevasses, the sharp line of the summit against the cosmos. Her world narrowed to that perfect, illuminated circle. She breathed, a slow, measured inhale, a long, controlled exhale. The tension of the past days, the condescension, the fight for survival, all of it dissolved into the cold, clean air. Here, in the silence, with the familiar weight of the rifle against her, she was perfectly at peace. From the shadows of the barracks, nearly 200 yards away, Corporal Finn O'Connell watched her. He had been unable to sleep, his mind replaying the events in the storm. He had come out for air and had seen her solitary figure making her way to the range. He watched now, hidden, not wanting to intrude. He saw not the quiet woman from the mess hall, but a force of nature in her element. He saw a stillness and a purpose that made the loud bravado of men like Miller seem childish and hollow. He was witnessing the quiet ritual of a master, a moment of connection between the warrior and her tool, between the ghost and the mountain. He finally understood the vast, silent chasm that separated competence from true mastery. He turned and walked back inside, leaving her to the stars and her silence. On the range, Anya slowly closed her eyes, the cold steel of the rifle a familiar, grounding presence against her cheek. Far to the east, the first, faint blush of dawn began to touch the highest, most remote peaks, painting them a soft, ethereal rose. Her watch was over.